All right, guys, so we're going to be talking about chapter 7, and the title of this is Ferment in the Middle East, the Rise of Islam and its Impact in the Region. So I love teaching world religion. It's always been one of my favorite topics, and it gives us a sense of how people live and what's important to them. So I want to treat this like all the religions we talk about with respect, and I think you'll enjoy it. I think Islam is a fascinating culture and religion. So, oops.
Chapter 7, Ferment in the Middle East, the Rise of
Sorry about
Islam.
that. There's some
After
kind
the
of
collapse of
recording.
Roman power in the
There
West,
are
the
these really neat
Eastern Roman
chapter
Empire,
summaries
centered
that
on
if you just want like
Constantinople, continued in the
five,
Eastern
10 minute
Mediterranean
version,
and
I
eventually
can send that
emerged
to
as
you.
the unique
So I have some of
Christian
those here. But
civilization.
Islam is a religion practiced by more than 1 billion people worldwide. The word Islam means submission to God in Arabic. A person who practices Islam is called a Muslim, which means one who submits. It's the second largest religion after Christianity and the fastest growing religion in the world. About 4 million Muslims live in the United States. Islam got its start 1400 years ago with one man, the Prophet Muhammad. In the year 610, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was a 40-year-old merchant in the ancient city of Mecca, in what is today Saudi Arabia. Muhammad had a divine revelation that he was one in the great line of prophets, stretching back from Jesus to Abraham. Allah, which is the Arabic name for God, told Muhammad that he must spread God's word to all humanity. Muhammad based his sermons on his divine revelations. As he preached around Mecca, he spoke out against corruption in society and how the rich were neglecting the poor. Threatened by his teachings, the powers that be in Mecca forced Muhammad into exile in 622. For the next decade, Muhammad continued preaching in the city of Medina and amassed thousands of followers. When he marched on Mecca in 630, the city fell without a fight, and Mecca has been the spiritual home of Islam ever since. The Quran is the Islamic holy book. Written in Arabic, it is said to be the divine word of God passed directly to Muhammad. Muhammad did not write down the Quran himself. Some of it may have been dictated during his lifetime, but much remains scattered in written fragments and in the memory of his followers after his death. After Muhammad's death, followers of Islam forged a vast empire that extended from Spain and North Africa to Southeast Asia. Islam spread widely because Muslims everywhere belong to the same community of believers, all worshiping the same God and reading the same holy book in the same language, regardless of what country they lived in or what their native language was. The building for worship used by Muslims is the mosque. Mosques are designed after Muhammad's home in Medina, which had a surrounding courtyard and columned hall. They are often decorated with geometric floral designs and elaborate patterns. These designs are used because Islam forbids imitating God's work by imitating living creatures in religious art. 5 times a day, a cry echoes through Muslim communities. It's the muezzin, the holy crier, calling all Muslims to pray. Everywhere in the world, Muslims stop and kneel in the direction of Mecca and recite prayers to Allah 5 times a day, at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and nightfall. This ritual has been part of Muslim daily life since the 7th century. Muslims follow the 5 pillars of Islam. They define duties that must be performed: declaring one's faith, ritual prayer, charity, spiritual discipline and fasting, and pilgrimage. The Quran's 114 chapters, or surahs, also include teachings on basic human rights and tolerance for other religions. In some Islamic cultures, it's common for women to wear veils, but women can also share many of the same responsibilities and rights as men. Some practices of Islam, such as taking more than one wife, are observed by very few modern Muslims. Today, fewer than a fifth of the Muslims in the world are Arabs. Followers of Islam can now be found around the globe. And it all began in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, 1400 years ago.
Did you know Ramadan is the 9th month of the Muslim?
Anyway, when we're talking about the birth of Islam, it helps to see where we're talking about. In fact, the early years of Islam really focused around the Arabian Peninsula, and two key towns are kind of central to the story. The first being Mecca, and the second Yathrib, renamed Medina. And really, this is kind of the center of where Islam began, and it's going to branch out within 400 years into quite a large empire. So let's talk about how Islam got started. Well, first off, the people living in Saudi Arabia are part of the ethnic group of Arabic. And Arabic is part of a larger ethnic family group called the Semitics. And ethnic Jewish people are a Semitic race. Arabs are a Semitic race. Some ethnicities within India. It's a pretty large ethnic family group. So and Semitic also relates to the language, and so they spoke this language. They were a part of this ethnic group. They're mentioned in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Arabs trace back their spiritual lineage to Abraham, just like Jewish people do. They're mentioned by the Greeks. Herodotus writes about them. And in fact, the Greeks simply called this entire peninsula Arabia, hence the name Saudi Arabia. Now, during the era of the Romans, this region was inhabited by a group called the Bedouins, mostly pastoralist, herding domesticated animals, moving from place to place, because, of course, Arabia is a very dry region. And this dominates a lot of the Middle East in terms of it being very dry. And so the Bedouins were a nomadic people, and they had no formal government, very much like in the next chapter we'll be talking about stateless societies in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, and these nomadic people, and how, even if you go and look at the Americas, like we were talking about last week, and look at the Sioux, for example, one of the largest nations without a formal political structure. There were clans and family groups, and then broader unions through language or common ethnic features. And so much the same here. And so they were organized on a tribal basis, and the chieftain of each tribe was called a sheik. And the sheik, typically by custom, was elected by a council of elders. And these elders were called Malich, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. But the Arabs of pre-Islamic time were very much polytheist, meaning they believed in many different gods. And there was a concept of a supreme god, Allah, which is just the Arabic name for God. In fact, when Islam began, Muhammad taught that Allah was the same God as Yahweh or Jehovah or the God of the Christian religion. They believe in the same God. It's just a different teaching within that faith. So this pre-Islamic faith was very communal, involving all members of the tribe. And so around the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, there was quite a bit of trade in this region, because really Arabia connects the main 3 continents, just like Egypt, just like Israel and Judea and Mesopotamia. These are all like crossroads between major land masses. And so lots of people are traveling through here. And so there's a lot of economic activity in the Arabian Peninsula, particularly in the sale of idols. And so that's going to kind of play into the story when we talk about how Muhammad was run out of Mecca because of his clear stance against the use of idols. So for one, there was a trade route that passed from the Mediterranean through Mecca into Yemen, and then by sea all the way across the Indian Ocean. So speaking of these trade routes, and the reason why this is important is because Islam spread some through conquest, but predominantly through trade. And it was brought, for example, across the Sahara by a group of traders called the Berbers. And they would travel by camel, crossing the world's largest desert, and then with them they would bring their religions. So now a little into the story. So by the time Muhammad was born, Arabia was a very active place, a very wealthy place, and he was actually born into a business family. And while he was orphaned, he was a very industrious person, grew up to become a manager of a caravan, kind of like a shipping company. He was a manager of his own caravan. And he, of course, had these visions that would later unite the entire Arab world. But like we were talking about at the beginning of class, his story we have to base on limited sources. And, you know, how do we corroborate these sources? Well, we're just going to use the sources we have to tell the story that we know. And additionally, the earliest versions of the Muslim holy book, the Quran, don't contain the same marks that modern Arabic uses to clarify meaning. So it's kind of like, if you're familiar with the Christian Bible, it was written in an ancient form of Greek called Koine Greek. And it doesn't even quite translate to modern Greek. And so if you're going to read the Bible as it was originally written, you have to learn this ancient version of Koine Greek. In addition to, you have to learn ancient Hebrew. And so unless you are familiar with both languages, you're relying on a translator's interpretation. And so it's the same with the Quran. You know, unless you're familiar with this archaic form of Arabic, then you're relying on the translator. So again, you know, subtle differences in the types of words and markings that clarify meaning. And so this leaves a lot of modern translations ambiguous and open to interpretation. And so it's neat. Like, I don't know if you've read many different versions of religious text, but it can come down to how a word is translated, and that can mean a lot. You know, certain versions leave out certain stories. Like, for example, in the Gospels, I don't know if you've heard the story of the angel at Bethesda, which is where the video game company Bethesda got their name. And it's a legend that's told in the book of Mark about this angel that appears at this pool, and whoever touched the pool would be magically cured of all their diseases. And so the angel would appear every morning, and then everybody would rush over to the pool before the angel disappeared. And so there's conflicting views on that story, and so not every version includes that story. And it's similar to the Quran here. So based on the limited sources we have, here's what we know. We know that Muhammad was born in Mecca. We know he was born to a merchant family. and we know he was orphaned at the age of 6. We know he grew up to be a business manager, and that his wife was a wealthy widow, and their union actually made both parties very prosperous. That she was also a wealthy business manager, and she had also lived in Mecca, and they dwelt together there for several years. But according to the story, Muhammad was always very troubled, and he would go off into the desert to pray, sometimes for long periods of time. And one of the things he was troubled about was this gap between the Bedouin culture of honesty and generosity. I've always heard, I haven't got to spend time in the Middle East, but there's just this incredible culture that when someone invites you to their home, that you become their guest, and while you're in their home, they treat you like family, and that's just the culture, that's the way they live, and that's very important to them. And so this is just something that's central to their way of life, and Muhammad felt that some of those values were being lost, and really he felt they were being lost by the wealthiest in Mecca. And so he would go to the hills to pray and to meditate, and it was there, according to the Quran, that he encountered the angel Gabriel. And so if you're familiar with the Christian story, the angel Gabriel appears quite often too. And there are various classes of angels, archangels, Gabriel being one of those, that would commonly bring messages from God to people. And so Muhammad claimed to have met this angel, and that this angel commanded him to preach revelations that he would receive, making him a prophet. And it's said that Muhammad was acquainted with the Jewish and Christian beliefs and came to believe that Allah, this supreme God in the Bedouin tradition, had already revealed himself to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to the prophets, and that he had been involved with other Semitic-speaking peoples. And so he believed that this supreme God, Allah, was the same God that the Hebrews called Yahweh or Jehovah. And he believed that he was receiving these new revelations in the same tradition. So he would have considered himself a prophet the same as Malachi or Micah or Job or Elijah. He did not consider himself a Messiah in the sense that Christians look to Jesus as a Messiah, but he did consider himself a prophet, meaning that God spoke through him in these revelations. So out of these revelations, which were eventually dictated to scribes, meaning they were eventually written down, came the Quran. And so the common translation is Qur apostrophe A-N, but some folks will use the English spelling of Koran. So you'll see it either way, but it just is the writings that contain the Holy Scriptures of Islam. And so the Quran told this story, but it also contains guidelines through which followers of Allah are expected to live. Now, as is often the case with any new religion, a lot of the folks in the area didn't see eye to eye with people who began to practice this new faith. And perhaps discouraged by this persecution of his followers, which was allegedly very brutal, Muhammad and his closest supporters actually left the city of Mecca, and they fled to a nearby town called Yathrib, also known as Medina. And so this flight, or this exodus, if you will, is called in the Quran the Hijra, or sometimes translated the Hajj. And so now one of the main pillars of Islam is a pilgrimage that Muslims make to the city of Mecca, and it's that flight from Mecca that is part of that tradition. So anyway, this hijra, or exodus, into Medina. So from Medina, this is where Muhammad and these other Muslims, as they're now calling themselves, Islam means submission to the will of Allah. Muslim means one who has submitted. And so they began calling themselves Muslims at this point and gained alliances and formed the first Muslim community, calling themselves the Ummah, just the community, the people. And while there, he raised a considerable army and returned to Mecca with an army. And so this time, instead of saying get out, particularly he had a problem with the sale of idols in Mecca. And this is one of the things that made people unhappy about his people, is that Islam has a strict prohibition on the creating of images that might represent a deity. And so, they had a lot to say about that. People of Mecca didn't like that they were criticizing, cutting into their trade. But anyway, when he came back with an army, most of the people of Mecca converted to Islam.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Did he have to actually kill anybody to get them to convert?
So, great question, and I was going to get to that, but I'll go ahead. Islam strictly forbids forced conversion and considers especially Jews and Christians, quote, protected peoples. But there's a strict prohibition against forced conversion. Not to say it's never happened, but they're not supposed to. Just like people aren't supposed to murder. It's not always strictly followed, but that's part of the core teachings, is that as they would grow, they did conquer regions, and they did become a nation with a military. But again, the practice was always, when they conquered a region, they would allow people to live their life and keep their culture.
Crusades, like when
That's it, yeah.
He took over Jerusalem, they allowed the Christians and Jews to practice freedom.
That's a great example. So the Crusades, which I feel like I maybe covered a little bit, but I think I had to gloss over it, were a series of 4 different wars, and really there were more than that, but the main 4. The first one was the only one, at least from the Christian perspective, that would have been called successful, where the Christian armies conquered the city of Jerusalem and held it for 100 years and built up a kingdom that they called the Kingdom of God. So hence the name, if you've ever seen the movie about the Crusades with Orlando Bloom. But yeah, so they held it for 100 years, and they killed many people in taking the city. But then Salah ad-Din, when he took the city, allowed the warriors to surrender and leave in peace, and made Jerusalem an open city that anybody could come and visit.
But 9/11 would be inconsistent with their religion, right?
So that's a great question too. So the word jihad gets thrown around a lot when you talk about 9/11, and jihad, according to the strict Muslim tradition, is a word to describe internal spiritual struggle. So, for example, if you read the Christian Bible in the book of Romans, chapter 7, Paul talks about this deep internal spiritual struggle, and he made a phrase that's popular now: the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and the Arabic word for that is jihad. So now, extreme fundamentalists took these concepts and did horrible things. Now, is that a reflection on the whole religion? No. Just like, is Dylan Roof a reflection on the Christian religion? Absolutely not. Is the Klan a reflection on the Christian religion? No. So you're right. There's lots of these misunderstandings and these incidents that people paint an entire group based on these incidents. So that's why I think it's good to talk about, and these are great examples too. So yeah, keep mentioning them. But Islam is a monotheistic faith, and now they consider the Jewish and Christian stories part of their story. And so, if you're a Christian and you talk to a Muslim, you would say, "So Jesus, right?" And they'd go, "Mm-hmm." So Abraham, yeah, they're good. They're good with that. But then they would say, but then there's Muhammad, and he's the prophet of Allah. And so they just make that additional statement. And then there's the teachings in the Quran. So like Christianity and Judaism, Islam is monotheistic. The name of their God is Allah, again, that they would consider the same as Jehovah or Yahweh, this all-powerful being who both created the universe and everything in it and sustains the universe and everything in it. So, for example, in Hindu faith, there is Brahman, who is similar to a supreme being. There are many aspects of Brahman, hence the thousands of deities in the Hindu faith. So there's Brahman, the creator, then there's Shiva, the destroyer, Vishnu, the preserver, and it gets complicated from there. But in Islam, there's Allah. And the practice of Islam is concerned with salvation and offers the hope of life after death. But unlike Christianity, Islam makes no claim to the divinity of their follower. So Muhammad would have considered himself a prophet in the tradition of Abraham. So just like Abraham in the book of Genesis did not consider himself to be divine, simply a person who herded sheep and was one of these, Bedouin chieftains. But then he, told the story of God as it was revealed to him. So anyway, Muhammad would have considered himself like Abraham and Moses, a prophet that was still a man. Islam developed a number of fundamental tenets, and the most important of these is to obey the will of Allah. And this means following a basic ethical code. So Islam is not just a belief system, but it's actually a culture. It's a way of life. And that culture can best be explained by looking at the 5 pillars of Islam. And so these pillars include, first, the belief in Allah. So there's the statement of faith that there's one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And you'll probably hear that translated into Arabic. I'm sure you've probably heard that statement before in Arabic. So it's a very common statement because that's just the Muslim statement of faith. Second is prayer 5 times a day. And public prayer on Fridays. And so if you know a Muslim person, and you're probably familiar with this if you know anything about them, that 5 times a day they're going to point toward Mecca and they're going to pray. And they generally bring some type of mat with them, kind of like a yoga mat that they can kneel and pray. Ideally they do this in a mosque, but really it can be done anywhere. There's a holy month called Ramadan, and so during the month of Ramadan, Muslims fast, so they choose not to eat while the sun is up. Next is a great pilgrimage that they call the Hajj. And so what we're looking at here is the city of Mecca, and this is a shrine called the Kaaba, or the Dome of the Rock. And all of these people, so that's the white that you can see around it, is people from all over the world, and they dress in white, and they go to walk around the Kaaba.
Is it 9?
I can't remember. Yeah, I mean, if you were to pull this up on, say, Google Earth, any given satellite photo is going to show a crowd of people, all day, every day, no matter the weather. People are coming. There's over 1 billion Muslims in the world, so they're coming from all over. Now, it's not a requirement. It's a practice. So, if someone is disabled or financially unable to make the trip, there's no punishment for not being able to go. But most Muslims would tell you that their pilgrimage is one of the high points of their life. So, for example, Malcolm X was a Muslim who made the Hajj, and it had a profound effect on it. He went from preaching violence to experiencing the true feeling of equality that people talk about from their pilgrimage, and he came back with a different message, very similar to what Dr. King taught. So again, powerful experience. But and then finally, giving alms to the poor. So there are Arabic names for these, and I can't remember all of them. There's the Hajj and the Zakat. I believe the prayer is called Salat, and then I can't remember the other two.
One who makes the pilgrimage is called Haji.
A Haji, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. So again, if you go to a mosque, their sanctuary, if you will, is always going to be pointed east, and that's just one neat thing about Islam. And in fact, some of the best astronomers were coming out of the Muslim community, and really one of the reasons why is because they want to know, no matter where they are in the world, where Mecca, what direction they want to pray toward. And so some of the greatest advancements in astronomy, say from the years 400 through to Copernicus, were made by Muslim astronomers, because really knowing where Mecca is important to them.
What is that? Be silent.
Odin! Land! Arab, speak what I draw.
There is only one God, and Muhammad is his. Prophet.
Go.
So, to a Muslim, Islam is not just a belief system, in the sense that, existentialism is a philosophy. Islam is a way of life, and it means the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah, and then Muslim means one who has submitted, and it's the will of Allah according to their belief system that they follow these tenets. And in addition to the 5 pillars, for example, Muslims are forbidden to gamble, to eat pork, to drink alcohol, or to engage in dishonest behavior. There's also strict sexual customs, and contact between genders are discouraged, and in fact marriages are arranged. And so very strict when it comes to the realm of relationships, and we'll get into that more in just a moment.
There are 2 main sects in the religion of Islam. 90% of all Muslims belong to the group known as Sunnis. Most of the remaining 10% are Shiites. While these 2 groups were both born during the very earliest period of Islamic history and share all of the basic beliefs of Islam, they differ over the choice of caliph, or successor to Muhammad, as leader of the Islamic community. the Sunnis believed that the honor should go to an elected member of the tribe of Muhammad. The Shiites.
So when Muhammad died, as is often the case with a new religion, it presents a challenge to those who come after. And this challenge presented his followers with a problem. You know, Muhammad never claimed divinity, but in Muslim communities, there's no real separation between church and state, not like what we have here in the United States. And so the question of who is going to lead the Muslim faith is also a question of who will be their political leader. And when Muhammad died, his closest followers selected Abu Bakr, and he would be his successor. And so under his leadership, the movement remained united and actually succeeded in quelling a number of dissenting factions. So for what it's worth, if you know your Christian history, there were dissenting factions within a few decades of Jesus' death. So there was a Greek group called the Gnostics that believed that the entire story of the death, crucifixion, resurrection was more of a philosophical concept rather than a historical event. And so, yeah, different factions, different interpretations. Anytime a religious figure dies, this is going to happen. Even when political figures die who found a dynasty or a nation. I mean, look what happened with Alexander the Great. So anyway, Abu Bakr managed to keep the movement together. And he began to use this Arabic tribal custom of a razzia, or raid, to expand their influence, to expand the authority of their movement. In fact, Abu Bakr began conquering neighboring peoples. Now, the first to fall were the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires. So in 636, Muslims defeated the Byzantine army on the Yamouk River, and 4 years later they conquered Syria and Cairo. Within 7 years, Persia. By 650, they had conquered the entire empire of the Sasanians. And in the meantime, they brought Egypt and other areas of North Africa under Arabic authority. So you guys had that question about forced conversion that was really neat, because I'm not going to say they were entirely a peaceful people. They were in the midst of conquering and building an empire. And these people would come under their authority, and their authority, again, was both political and religious. And so that means that as these people were conquered, they were living under Muslim law. So historians have proposed various explanations for this rapid expansion of the Arab peoples and this rise of the religion of Islam. So some historians have suggested that this rapid expansion may have been promoted by a prolonged drought, possibly planned by the ruling class who wished to extend their trade. Historians have also suggested that the Byzantine Empire had already been weak by a plague epidemic. But whatever the cause, Islam's ability to unite the Bedouin people played an important role. Now, led by a series of brilliant generals, the Arabs formed a large, extremely motivated army whose valor and honor were enhanced by the belief that dying in battle guaranteed a place in paradise. You know, so back to the Crusades, crusading warriors had the same concept. So additionally, those who were conquered often had the option to convert to Islam, or if they chose not to convert, they would simply have to submit to Muslim rule. And then there was an extra tax they would have to pay if they did not choose to convert. But under these conditions, local populations often regarded Arab rule as even preferable to Byzantine rule, or that of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia. Additionally, the simplicity and direct character of this new religion, as well as the egalitarian qualities, made Islam an attractive option to people throughout the region. So the concept of egalitarianism is probably best illustrated by that picture at the Kaaba. So Muslims believe that all are equal in the eyes of Allah, and then they practice this when they go on pilgrimage by all wearing white and all walking around together and calling themselves brother and sister. So you can see that the expansion of Islam occurred rapidly, and it's quite tremendous. But division was soon to come. So not all of Muhammad's followers agreed with the selection of Abu Bakr as the first caliph or leader. In fact, some backed Muhammad's cousin and his son-in-law, Ali. That claim was ignored, however, and after Bakr's death, Umar and later Uthram succeeded him. Though Uthram was assassinated, and Ali was finally chosen as the caliph. This started a factional struggle, and in 661, Ali was also assassinated. So one of the chief rivals replaced him and made the caliphate a hereditary title within his own family, of course, called the Umayyads. So this would be the Umayyad dynasty. But dynasties often have problems with succession, and the factional struggles didn't stop. But they also didn't stop Arab expansion. Arab armies advanced across North Africa, conquering the Berbers. Around 710, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and occupied the southern part of Spain. In fact, Morocco is still predominantly a Muslim place. An Arab power also extended through to the east, consolidating Islamic rule in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, as well as Persia, as well as northward into Central Asia. The Arabs continued to have a new factional dispute with many Muslims of non-Arabic background, who resented the favoritism shown to Arabs. So in some cases, this resentment would lead to revolt. For example, in 680, Ali's second son, Hussein, disputed the legitimacy of the Umayyads. He incited his supporters, called Shiites, to rise up. And so although they were defeated, and Hussein himself died in battle, the split between the Sunni, that is the Orthodox Muslims, who adhered to the Umayyad family following the hereditary lineage dating back to Muhammad, and then the Shiites. Again, a factional group began by Hussein. So resentment was also found in Persia and in North Africa. And where resistance continued, it would often lead to revolt. For example, in 750, Abu al-Abbas, a descendant of Muhammad's uncle, led to the overthrow of the Umayyads and the establishment of a new dynasty called the Abbasid dynasty in what is today modern-day Iraq. So the Abbasids, I know it can get confusing keeping up with all these, but there's three main factions in Islam today. There are others. There's really a fourth, but Sunni, Shiite, and Shia, and then Sufi are the mystics. But Sunni and Shiite are probably the two most well known. But the Abbasids brought political, economic, and cultural change. The dynasty founded an astronomical observatory and established a foundation for translating classical Greek works. The Arabs had conquered many of the richest routes to the east, and Baghdad became the center of an enormous commercial market. And it was strategically positioned to take advantage of both river traffic to the Persian Gulf and the land route from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. So just wanted to throw this up there to compare. how prosperous and how populous really the Arabic Empire had become. So even though there were these core divisions, I mean, look how many people lived in Baghdad compared to, say, Rome. You know, London doesn't even register at this time. Even Constantinople, we talked about that super important city that was incredibly wealthy, that controlled trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, pales in comparison. You know, when the Mongols conquered Baghdad, it was said they slaughtered 1 million people. Now again, is that entirely accurate? I don't know. But given the population of Baghdad at the time, you know, it's possible. So under the Abbasids, the caliphs became more regal. They ruled by autocratic means, and that means they were almost indistinguishable from kings and emperors in neighboring states. As that happened, the bureaucracy which administered the caliphate became very complicated too. Now, there always has remained an element of instability. You know, for example, today the Muslim world is broken up into many different nations, and some are predominantly one of these factions and some are the other. Now, the real trouble with nations like Iraq was the boundaries of Iraq weren't drawn by these natural means of people who selected their nation based on their culture. Iraq was drawn by Great Britain. In fact, most of the Middle East was drawn by Great Britain. And I don't want to simplify the problems in the Middle East, but that didn't help. And so you have, you know, for example, 3 distinct people groups in Iraq that really don't like each other. You know, the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis, and there's a violent history there. So where it would have made more sense for those people to identify and select their own national groups, it didn't work out that way. So there's remained an element of instability.
That kind of like Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan.
That's a great example, yes. So formerly, India and Pakistan were all one nation under British rule. But as soon as they gained their independence, I mean, they split within a few years. And then, yeah, and you know, national lines aren't, I don't know, nationalism is a relatively new concept. And these political lines that people have drawn don't always make sense. And so, you know, that's where like Pakistan and Afghanistan actually share a lot of common culture and a lot of relatives and a lot of common language and belief systems. And so, you know, perhaps if they were carving out their own nation, it would be some hodgepodge of Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, and so forth. So, again, national lines, who knows?
Sounds like the British drew almost all of them.
The British, yeah, and well, the real problem is World War I, and we're going to get to that a little later. But by the time of the First World War, the Ottomans controlled the entire Middle East, and so just like, you know, the end of the First World War created a lot of problems for Germany, namely because they broke up Germany trying to disempower them. They did the same to Austria-Hungary. They also did the same to the Ottoman Empire. But when I mean the Ottoman Empire, I'm talking about the entire Middle East. So they broke it up into little pieces, and perhaps drawing those lines purposely to keep them divided, to keep them from rising up and becoming powerful again.
Fight within themselves if they can't get rid of the British.
Yeah, but it's also led to a lot of the messes we have there. So,
Yep.
good
Well,
times.
the astronauts say there are no lines on Earth when they look down. So I like that thing.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think these national boundaries are just, I don't know. I mean, there was one school of thought after the Second World War. In fact, I'm way off topic, but John Maynard Keynes proposed a worldwide currency system and proposed that maybe these national lines were a dumb idea to begin with. And he was more of a globalist. He would have preferred some type of global government, giving the UN more of an executive role. Most folks disagreed. I don't really know. Luckily, I don't have to answer those types of questions. So, but yeah, it has created numerous problems. But I digress. So, there were always disputes about succession, and this is really because, well, Islam is not just a religion. It's a political force. And honestly, when you study the history of Christianity, you'll find a lot of those gray areas too. You know, in my high school class today, I was just teaching about the Great Schism in France, where there was a pope in Avignon and there was a pope in Rome, and both declared each other heretics and excommunicated each other. It's a real messy story, but it just goes to show that no one religion is entirely entirely united. Okay, so these disputes over succession were just common. These places like Baghdad were so incredibly wealthy, but of course that can lead to corruption. And these lives of luxury enjoyed by the caliph and these other elites really seem to run counter of the strict moral code of Islam. You know, just like, you know, for example, Jesus taught it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. You know, sell everything you have and follow me. Muhammad had a very similar philosophy, but that's not how these religions have played out. And so the process of disintegration has been accelerated by changes taking place, for example, within the armed forces and the bureaucracy of this empire. And of course, there's environmental problems. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were so heavily utilized that, and so many structures built around them, and so much change to the natural environment that these rivers were beginning to silt up. So I guess one way to illustrate this is if you look at the French Broad, when it floods, what color is it?
Murky brown.
Yeah, it's gross. Now, if you go to Courthouse Creek, the source of the French Broad, what color is it when it floods? It's cool. It's way up near the Parkway. You got to drive this like sketchy dirt road in the middle of a flood. I've done it.
Blue then?
It's clear. It is beautiful. You can almost drink the water in the midst of a flood. I've actually paddled Courthouse Creek, and I've paddled all the sections of the French Broad from here to Asheville to the Tennessee state line. And my favorite part is the source in the mountains because it's clean. It's so cool. It's pristine. But of course, when you get down here, it floods gross brown. And that is because of development. And what that means is it's washing sediment. So if you look at these dams that are further down the French Broad, they have to be dredged out every so often because this sediment builds up. Well, what happens if there's not major dams? Well, that sediment just washes down until it eventually gets to these flat areas. And what can happen, silting up means so much soil washes down that it begins to just kind of fill in the riverbed. And so this can cause a major environmental issue in such an arid region like Mesopotamia. So this makes the country's canal system virtually unusable, and this can lead to widespread food shortages because in a place like Mesopotamia, which literally means land between the rivers, those two rivers are everything. And if they become unusable, people can't grow food. And we're talking mass famine and starvation. So by the end of the 10th century, the Islamic world was held together only by a common commitment to the Quran and the use of Arabic as the main means of communication. So here's what the Abbasid Caliphate looked like at the height of its power. And so, you know, we're talking about these massive empires. Next, I wanted to briefly look at the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were a nomadic people from Central Asia, and they had converted to Islam and flourished as military mercenaries for the Abbasid Caliphate. They were known for their skill as mounted archers. The Seljuk Turks grew in number until they occupied the eastern province. And in 1055, a Turkish leader captured Baghdad and assumed command of the empire, claiming the title of Sultan. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire foolishly challenged the Turks. They responded by taking control of all of Anatolia. The Turks were viewed by the people of Constantinople as barbarians who destroyed civilizations and oppressed populations. However, it's likely that the arrival of the Turks was actually beneficial. The Turkish rulers who had converted to Islam brought an end to the squabbles between Sunni and Shiite, revitalized Islamic law and institution, and provided stability to the empire, which helped restore its prosperity. Unfortunately, Seljuk domination over the old Abbasid Empire was very temporary. It provoked resentment on the part of the Persian Shiites, who viewed the Turks as betraying the true faith of Islam. And for several decades, a rebel group terrorized government officials and other leading figures. And we've already talked about the Crusades some, but I'll just summarize. The emperor of the Byzantine Empire, his name was Alexius I, requested help of the Catholic Church against the Turks, who at this time occupied all of Anatolia, what is today the nation of Turkey. And so Constantinople was under siege. And so he called for assistance from these other Christian states in Europe to protect his empire against the Seljuk Turks. And so he appealed to Christians by claiming that the Turks were desecrating Christian shrines in the Holy Land and molesting Christian pilgrims who were en route to the shrines. So there were a total of 4 crusades. The first was the most successful. It captured the city of Jerusalem and built what they called the kingdom of God, or the Christian states in the Holy Land. Now, later crusades, though, would not be successful at all. And the Christians would become a minor political force in Middle Eastern affairs. So it's likely that the Crusades did little in the Middle East militarily, but quite a bit when you think of trade, culture, and commerce, because it did open up new trade routes between Europe and the Middle East. And of course the Mongols. I've always enjoyed the Mongols. Khan Eglinton wrote a great series on the story of Genghis Khan all the way through to his grandson Kublai Khan. I highly recommend it. So I can't remember the name of the series, but if you just look up Khan Eglinton, you'll find it. Now, the Mongols weren't Muslims. They found it very difficult to adapt to the settled conditions that they found in the major cities of the Middle East. Their treatment of local population in conquered territories was quite brutal. They would wipe out not only entire families, but they would even kill their pets. Genghis Khan had a tradition of, when approaching a city, he would put up a white tent. And a white tent meant, let's talk. If you surrender, if you pay tribute, we'll leave you alone. And if the city refused, he'd put up the red tent. And this meant, and they would stick to it, we're going to kill every man in the city. Every warrior will die. And if the city continued to resist, like Baghdad did, he'd put up the black tent. That means he'd kill everybody. And the book mentions not just everybody, but the pets too. I mean, everyone would die. Like they're just one of the most brutal people I've ever studied. And they also conquered one of the largest empires in all of human history. They advanced as far as the Red Sea. They never quite conquered Egypt, but of course as far north as Russia, as far east as China. They conquered the largest overland empire. The only ones that beat them were the British through their overseas empire. So Mongol rulers, though, were never quite interested in ruling. Their interest was war and conquest. That's their culture. And so often Mongol ruling class would assimilate into whatever culture they were ruling over. And they would adopt that culture, and the bureaucrats of that people would wind up doing most of the administering of the empire. So Abad al-Rahman managed to escape the overthrow of Baghdad, made his way to Spain. By 756, he had legitimized his authority in southern Spain and taken the title of emir, or commander. His capital was a city called Cordoba, And here he would build a vibrant new center for Islamic culture. Andalusia became part of a vast trade network that stretched from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Red Sea and beyond, allowing valuable new agricultural products to be introduced to the Iberian Peninsula. It also flourished as an artistic and intellectual center, with intellectual leaders arriving from all parts of the Islamic world, bringing with them their knowledge of medicine, astronomy, math, and philosophy. And one major reason for this was the atmosphere of tolerance in social relations, providing an environment for many Christians and Jews to maintain their religious beliefs. Now, by the end of the 10th century, however, factionalism was beginning to undermine the foundations of the empire, and Christian kingdoms that had established themselves in the north of the Iberian Peninsula were consolidating their position and beginning to expand southward. Now, to fight back, Muslim rulers asked for help from a group called the Almoravids, and these were also Muslims living in Morocco, the southern part of Spain. And when they won, the Almoravids stayed in the area to establish their own rule. This rule was intolerant of other ideas, and so the Almoravids brought an end to the era of religious tolerance and intellectual achievement. This did nothing to stop the Christian advance, though, and so Christian armies would move relentlessly southward in Spain and fight with the Moors for over 200 years. So historians have often described the Reconquista of Spain. You know, you think 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 1492 is significant because it's also the year of the Reconquista, when the Christian king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, established a Christian rule in Spain. So they often look at the Reconquista as a positive development. But there's another school of thought. Some have argued that the Moorish era in Spain was actually a period of cultural tolerance, one that was followed by the bloody era of the Spanish Inquisition, when the Catholic Church persecuted others for their refusal to follow the so-called true faith. So some historians, however, argue that this portrayal of the Moorish era as a period of cultural tolerance overstates the case, pointing out that the true religious tolerance was never achieved, and that any such era came to an end with the arrival of the Almoravids. So one historian even argued that it was at best an era of cultural interaction, resulting really in a hardening of attitudes on both sides. So to be Muslim is not simply to worship Allah, but also to live according to His law as it is written in the Quran. And as Allah decreed in the Quran, so must humans behave. So there's no demarcation between church and state. So for early converts, establishing political institutions and practices that conform to Islamic doctrine was a daunting task. The will of Allah, for example, was not precise about the relationship between political and religious authority. Additionally, establishing political institutions for a large multicultural empire proved a challenge for traditionally pastoral nomadic Arabs. But during Muhammad's life, the problem could be avoided. After his death, however, these succession issues became all too common. So the Abbasid era was probably one of the most prosperous periods in the history of the Middle East. Trade flourished, not only in the Islamic world, but also in China. Trade goods were carried by ship, and the fleets of the desert, that is, camel caravans. The most important urban buildings were usually the palace for the caliph and the great mosque. Now, the bulk of the population continued to live in the countryside and to support themselves by farming or by herding animals. Eating habits varied depending on the economic standing and religious preference. Fruit, spices, and often various sweets were delicacies, and the poor were often forced to survive on boiled millet or peas. we're getting close. So here's an example of this Muslim architecture. I just think it's beautiful. Again, when I get to travel the world, which maybe never, really want to see Istanbul, all the places. I want to walk into the Hagia Sophia when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, renamed to Istanbul. One of the most beautiful Christian churches in the world was converted to a mosque, and now it's one of the most beautiful mosques in the world. Again, just a neat example of cultural blending.